At Christmas dinner, Dad stood up and announced, "We're finally selling the lake house, and you're not seeing a cent." My brother snorted. "Good. You never earned it anyway." Then Dad smirked. "It's already sold. $12 million. All cash. Silverpine Ventures." I calmly took a sip of my wine and said, "Dad, I am Silverpine Ventures." The silence that followed was delicious. That my name is Nate, and I'm 31 years old. For most of my life, I've learned to absorb the subtle barbs, the quiet dismissals that felt less like direct attacks and more like a slow, steady erosion. I come from a family that relishes grand celebrations but often overlooks the individuals within them, at least individuals like me. You know the type. Families who gauge your worth by social media validation and compare life's milestones, as if it's some competitive sport. I was never the one winning. My older brother, Michael, on the other hand, was always the undisputed champion of our family's highlight reel. He was loud, effortlessly charming, and his life seemed perfectly curated for public consumption. He was the captain of the football team, the one who always knew the right thing to say, the one my parents proudly introduced to everyone. My path was different. I was the kid who loved books more than sports, who spent hours in the garage taking apart old electronics, and who found more comfort in solitude than in a crowd. My successes, when they came, were quiet ones. Good grades, a scholarship, a job in tech that required more code than charisma. To my family, these were nice but not amazing. They were footnotes to Michael's front-page headlines. My sister, Chloe, was the golden girl, the influencer, the one whose every whim was indulged, even with funds that, as I would later discover, were never truly meant for her alone. The one thing that everyone in our family agreed on, the one place that held a sacred spot in all our memories, was the lake house. It was a sprawling, rustic cabin built by my grandfather on a pristine piece of land. It was our summer home, a place of bonfire nights and late-night talks. For Michael, it was the backdrop for his epic parties. For me, it was where I learned to fish with my grandfather, where I would sit on the dock for hours, just watching the water. It was a place where, for a brief time, I felt like I belonged. When my grandfather passed away, the lake house became a point of contention. He had left it to both my father and his sister, but with the understanding that it would eventually pass down to Michael and me. A trust was set up, managed by my parents, to cover its upkeep. But over the years, as my parents' lavish lifestyle grew and their investments became riskier, the funds in the trust seemed to dwindle. The lake house became less a home and more an albatross, a financial burden they were eager to shed. I had watched this unfold from a distance. While Michael was busy with his social media ventures and influencer lifestyle, and Chloe was bankrolled for her endless skincare routines and travel content, I was quietly building my own life. My parents saw my work as a steady but unexciting career. They never asked about my projects or my company. They just assumed I was doing something with computers. I never corrected them. I learned early on that their approval was a finite resource, and I wasn't going to spend my life trying to earn something that was never truly available to me. I started my own company, a small but fiercely successful tech venture focused on a niche market. We weren't flashy, but we were profitable. My company's name was Silverpine Ventures, a nod to the trees that surrounded the lake house I loved so much. This year's Christmas dinner was held at my parents' sprawling, meticulously decorated home. The air was thick with the scent of pine and roasting turkey, but also with the familiar tension that always simmered just beneath the surface. Michael was there with his wife, regaling everyone with stories of his latest brand deal. Chloe, of course, was documenting every moment for her social media, her phone perpetually held aloft. I sat in a quiet corner, nursing a glass of wine, a silent observer of the spectacle. My mother was flitting around, making sure every detail was perfect, while my father held court at the head of the table. The conversation eventually turned to the one topic that had dominated their lives for months: the lake house. "It's all sorted," my father announced, a wide, self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. "After all these years, the deal is finally done. We're getting rid of the old place." Michael and his wife nodded eagerly, a shared look of relief on their faces. "It was just so much work to maintain," Michael's wife chimed in. "And the taxes were just a killer." My father leaned back in his chair, puffing out his chest. "We're finally selling the lake house. and you're not seeing a cent." The words weren't a shock to me. They were a confirmation. I had long suspected that any inheritance would be Michael's, but to hear it stated so plainly, with such a sense of triumph, was a new kind of gut punch. My brother laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet space. "Good. You never earned it anyway, Nate," he said, turning to me with a smug look. "You never even went there anymore. It's not like you cared." The family murmured in agreement, a chorus of silent judgment. They saw my absence as disinterest, not as a desperate act of self-preservation. I took a slow sip of my wine to cool liquid, a small comfort against the heat of the moment. I had been planning this moment for weeks. The decision hadn't been an easy one. It was a final, painful severance, a tearing of the last thread of connection I had to the family fantasy. I had worked hard to build a life where I didn't need their approval, but a small, naive part of me had always hoped they would one day see my worth. This was the moment that hope died. My father, mistaking my silence for defeat, leaned forward, a conspiratorial glint in his eye. "We've got a fantastic offer. $12 million. All cash. The buyer is a company called Silverpine Ventures." Completely out of the blue, but their offer was too good to refuse. "We're set for life." He was reveling in the moment, a final act of one-upmanship, a triumphant victory in his eyes. I set my wine glass down gently, the small clink on the table the only sound in the room. I met his gaze, my voice calm, flat, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Dad," I said, "I am Silverpine Ventures." The room fell dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the gentle whir of the Christmas tree lights. My mother's hand froze, mid-air, as she reached for a canopy. Michael's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter, blank confusion. My father's jaw, which had been set in a proud, defiant line, went slack. He looked at me, then at the empty wine glass, then back at me again, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had just been scattered across the floor. "What?" Michael finally sputtered, the first to break the silence. "What are you talking about?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "The lake house," I said, "has been my home for the past 6 months. We closed on the sale last week. The funds from the trust, the ones you claimed were depleted, were more than enough to cover the full asking price. My company paid for it." My father's face went from shock to a pale, mottled red. You can't," he stammered. "We didn't." He trailed off, his bravado completely gone. The buyer was a corporate entity. We didn't know who they were. That was the whole point." "Exactly," I replied. "You never asked. You never looked past the surface. You never cared enough to see that the little projects I was working on weren't just a hobby. They were a career. A successful one." My brother, Michael, stood up, his face a mask of furious indignation. "You're a liar. You did this to get back at us." "Get back at you?" I laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Michael, I didn't do this to get back at you. I did this to reclaim something that was being sold out from under me. I did it because this house was the only place in the world where I ever felt like I was worth something. And you were just going to sell it off to the highest bidder without a second thought, without even asking me if I was interested in keeping it." My mother finally spoke, her voice a small, terrified whisper. "But the money, Nate, you bought it for $12 million. She was still focused on the price, on the status of it all, even in the face of this staggering revelation. "Yes, Mom," I said, looking at her directly for the first time all night. $12 million. A figure that the trust fund, if properly managed, would have covered with ease. I had to use my own money because, as you well know, the trust was empty. I had to buy it back from you to protect it." The room fell silent again, the full weight of my words finally settling in. The facade of their success, the lie of the depleting trust, the casual cruelty of their announcement. It all came crashing down around them. I stood up, pushing my chair back from the table. "I'm not here for a fight. I'm not here to gloat. I'm here to let you know that the game is over. You can't use me as a prop in your story anymore. The lake house is mine. I bought it. It's a closed matter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some packing to do." The new owners have been very patient. I walked out of the dining room and out the front door, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. The cold night air felt like a breath of fresh air. I got into my car and drove, not to my small apartment, but to the lake house. The new lake house. My lake house. Pulling into the long, winding driveway, I saw the familiar silhouette of the cabin against the moonlit sky. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of wood and pine welcoming me home. It wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for myself. It was about finally, definitively, telling them that I mattered. I walked to the living room, a large, open space with a massive stone fireplace. I sat on the hearth, staring into the dark, empty grate, a sense of peace washing over me. I had finally won, not by playing their game, but by walking away and building my own. The lake house was no longer a symbol of a past I was excluded from. It was a symbol of a future I had finally chosen for myself. The silence wasn't a punishment. It was a sanctuary. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely at home. The next morning, my phone was a flurry of activity. Missed calls, texts, and frantic voicemails. Michael's messages were a mix of rage and confusion. "What the hell was that, Nate? You're insane. You're going to ruin everything." My mother's calls were laced with a desperate, unfamiliar tone. "Nathan, honey, please call us back. This isn't funny. You're tearing the family apart." Chloe, ever the public relations expert, had already posted a cryptic story about unforeseen family drama and negative energy. I ignored them all. I had David, my lawyer, on speed dial, and he was already anticipating their next move. He had been instrumental in this. After my jail call a few months prior, when my parents had dismissed me for Chloe's gender reveal, David had not only gotten me out, but had also helped me uncover the truth about my grandfather's trust fund. The fund, meant for both Chloe and me, had been systematically drained and redirected by my parents to fuel Chloe's influencer lifestyle and their own lavish spending. They had forged documents, claiming I had forfeited my share. David had helped me gather the evidence, bank statements, forged signatures, and even a damning recorded call where my mother casually joked about me being too distant to ever notice their schemes. The Christmas dinner revelation was just the first domino. The real battle began the next day. David filed a lawsuit for civil fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, along with a motion to freeze all their assets. The legal documents were served at their home, a stark contrast to the festive atmosphere of the previous night. My parents were stunned, their carefully constructed facade crumbling. Michael and Chloe, for the first time, were truly exposed to the consequences of their parents' actions and, by extension, their own complicity. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings. My parents hired an expensive lawyer who tried to paint me as vindictive, emotionally unstable, and driven by jealousy. They argued that the trust was flexible and that they were merely allocating resources based on need. My lawyer, David, systematically dismantled their arguments with irrefutable evidence. He brought in Harold, my grandfather's old friend and business associate, who testified about my grandfather's explicit intentions for the trust, that it was meant to be equally split, and that he had specifically worried about me being overlooked. Harold's testimony was powerful, painting a picture of a loving grandfather who wanted to ensure I was never at anyone's mercy. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't play the victim. I spoke calmly about what it felt like to grow up invisible, to be constantly dismissed while Chloe was celebrated for every minor achievement. I recounted the time I broke my arm at 13 and waited hours in the ER because Chloe was getting her nails done with Mom. I spoke of my trade school graduation, which no one attended because they were at Chloe's boyfriend's album launch. And then, I spoke about the jail call, the moment they chose a gender reveal party over their son in a holding cell. My voice cracked, not from anger, but from the raw ache of finally being seen, not as a utility, but as a person who had been profoundly hurt. The judge, a stern but fair woman, listened intently, nodding slowly. The evidence was overwhelming. The court found clear evidence of financial mismanagement, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. The verdict was decisive. All control of the trust, both original and remaining assets, was transferred to me. My parents were ordered to repay the misused funds within 18 months or face asset seizure. Chloe was not required to pay anything, on the condition that she had no future claim to the estate. I didn't look at my parents when the judgment was read, but I caught Chloe's eye as we left. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that had finally come to light. The weeks after the ruling felt surreal. I was suddenly contacted by estate managers, accountants, and even distant family members who had suddenly remembered my name. I ignored most of them. Instead, I did something different. I went back to Grandpa's workshop. It was still there, locked up behind the old house, rust on the hinges, but everything inside preserved like time had frozen. His tools, his blueprints, his thermos still sitting on the shelf. I spent that weekend cleaning it out. Then I called. Harold. We reopened the business. Not HVAC, not trust fund consulting, just craft. My grandfather's original trade, woodworking, custom tables, chairs, restorations. I hired 2 of my old coworkers, brought them in on full pay with benefits, told them we'd make something real, something that lasted. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't chasing anything. Not approval, not recognition, just peace. My parents, they moved out of their house 3 months after the ruling, sold their car. The foreclosure notice came 2 weeks after that. I didn't gloat. I didn't show up. I didn't say a word because they didn't call from jail. They didn't come to my graduation. They didn't ask if I was okay when I was locked in a holding cell, scared and alone. So, I let them figure it out. Chloe moved to a smaller apartment, started a podcast of all things, finding balance. It was called. I listened to half an episode. She talked about rebuilding trust, accountability, mental health. Maybe it was all performative. Or maybe, maybe, she was learning. I never reached out. But one day, she left a small package on my porch. No note, just a photo of Grandpa and me taken when I was 10, sanding down an old table. On the back, she'd written, "He saw you, Nate. Even when we didn't. I hope this helps you remember." It did. The workshop is full of life now. Every evening, I sit at the big cedar bench near the window, lights streaming in, tools lined up like soldiers ready for battle. And sometimes when it's quiet, I hear his voice. My grandfather's, rough but kind. "You did good, kid." And I smile, because for the first time in forever, I believe it.